Okay, let's make a start. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar. You're very welcome, and we're pleased to have you here. My name's Hannah Jameson. I'm from London Councils, and this afternoon we are really pleased to be launching the latest consumption-based emissions data for London, and we've got a fantastic session ahead of us to really find out more about the latest trends in consumption-based emissions. We've got a panel to help us think about what they're seeing in the data, the value of that data, how we use it to drive action in London. And then we've got a showcase of some of the brilliant work taking place across local government and with our partners to really start to address some of the challenges we see and to drive changes in patterns and behaviour and reduce our emissions. This afternoon's session is being recorded. You might have seen a notification pop up. It will be, I think, available afterwards as well. If you want to share it with colleagues, that would be very welcome. We'll be putting some of the resources that we mention in the chat or possibly in the Q&A, but you will be notified and there'll be links shared for today's deck, for some of the reports that we talk about and the data and so on. So you'll have a chance to really dig into that and look after that, to look into that after the session. Throughout the meeting, there'll be a chance for you to ask questions. The way that this is set up, it'll be using the Q&A function. And we've got a good chunk of time at the end where we can bring those questions back in and ask any one of our panelists to address those. So you might have questions about what does the data say and what does really, what does that mean, and some information about our projects as well. So a chance for you to feed in. So please do put your questions in the Q&A. We'll collate those and we'll have time to discuss those afterwards. Right, so let me kick off with the speakers this afternoon. And we're going to start, as I said, by finding out more about the latest release. This is a really fantastic piece of work. We're now in the third year of the consumption-based emissions report. We are very grateful to be joined by Anne Owens from Leeds University, who's been working with us on this for several years. And this is a kind of co-commission project, a partnership between London, GLA and London Councils. So some of you may have come across some of this before, so we'll be talking a little bit both about what consumption-based emissions is and some of the trends in the data. As I said, we're then going to have a bit of panel to talk about the city's role in tackling consumption-based emissions, some thoughts there around how we use the data and what it means, and then some highlights from the climate programme, talking about what we're doing already. And as always, opportunities for any boroughs or partners to get more involved in that work, and we'll provide information on how you can do that afterwards. But without further delay, it's going to be a tightly chaired session. We've got lots to talk about and lots to hear from. So I'm going to move on first of all, and can I hand over to you?
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. So I'm going to be giving a very brief overview of what we've found in the latest version of the consumption-based account, looking at London, comparing London with trends that we've seen in the rest of the UK. And then I'll let you know how you can start to explore this data for yourselves. Next slide, please. Okay, so on this slide, it's a bit busy, but you can see a comparison of the per capita consumption-based emissions for London in blue and the UK in red. So you can see that London is always tracking slightly below what we see for the UK, which is a good news story. But the same kind of patterns and trends are observable. So in London, in 2021, we find that the carbon footprint or consumption-based emissions are just under 9 tonnes per person. And this represents a reduction of 35% since the beginning of the time period where we've started to be able to track this, which was the year 2001. Emissions tend to follow what's happening in the economy. So you can see in both the UK and London, there was a large reduction during 2007 and 2009, which was due to the economic crisis at the time. Post 2014, our analysis at the University of Leeds shows that these reductions were due to efforts to decarbonise the electricity grid. And because electricity is part of the production processes of all of the goods and services that we consume, that sort of trickles through into the consumption-based emissions account. And then obviously we see large reductions in 2020 due to what happened in that year, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, it's been quite exciting working on the emissions this year because we finally got the data through for what happened in 2021. And we're all quite interested to see whether the reductions that we'd seen in 2020 continued or whether there was a rebound, sort of once COVID restrictions started to ease. And more interestingly, what areas were we seeing the rebound in? Now, in London, if you look at that blue line, there's actually an increase of 10% in the consumption-based emissions per person between 2020 and 2021. And there are certain products which people have bought a little bit more of. There was a slight increase in the carbon intensity of the grid, maybe as sort of the economy started to get moving again. Things still weren't quite being produced in the most efficient manner that they were pre-COVID. And this was particularly seen in the food sector. There was a slight carbon intensity increase. Interestingly, London's sort of rebound was one of the lowest if we consider the what happened amongst the regions. I think the data shows that Northern Ireland had the smallest rebound, but London was definitely one of the smaller ones. The average rebound for the UK was around 15%. If you dig into the data, it becomes quite clear why London didn't increase as greatly as everywhere else. And it's all to do with the fact that London's got an excellent public transport system. London is less reliant on private transport. So in 2021, when most of the country was suddenly starting to move around a little bit more and using their private cars, because Londoners don't use the cars as much as everywhere else, this effect of the rebound was lessened. Next slide, please. So we can start to break down London's footprint into the types and goods and services that people consume. And, you know, this drives the patterns that we observe. Services and transport have reduced the most since 2001. Housing has reduced by quite a significant amount as well. And this can mainly be explained by transport policies and decarbonisation of electricity. Goods have reduced by around a quarter and food by around a fifth. Between 2020 and 2021, as the COVID-19 restrictions eased, emissions increased across every single category except transport, which actually in London continued to see a decrease. Housing and goods increased by the most, followed by food and services. Next slide, please. As well as giving the data for London as a whole, we can start to build the picture of what's happening at the borough level. So we have data available for all of the London councils and the City of London, and you can start to order them in terms of largest to smallest. We find that the City of London has the highest per capita footprint of around 11.5 and Newham the smallest. But interestingly, if you track this data over time, we found that the differences between the highest consumption emissions and the lowest is actually reducing over time. So the graph is becoming sort of flatter. There aren't huge differences really in the composition of what is being bought in each borough. The category that's largest across all boroughs is housing. So we can start to use this data to think about policies that would work London-wide. Obviously, there may be a need to try and reduce emissions from the housing stock. In the slightly wealthier areas of London, we do see a greater impact associated with spend on restaurants, clothing, air travel and recreation. Next slide, please. So London has led the way really in commissioning this type of data. We've been doing it for 3 years at the borough level, and at the sort of Greater London area, we've worked closely producing this type of data for I think over 5 years now. When myself and my team were putting together the data for London, we realised there was a huge opportunity to actually expand this work to cover all local authorities in England, Scotland and Wales. And 2 years ago, I managed to get some funding to do this from the Place-Based Climate Action Network to build basically an interactive website, which could act as a repository where local authorities can actually view, compare, and download this data. So, thank you ever so much to London councils and Re London for helping to sort of instigate this project. And it's getting a lot of interest. And I think actually, in terms of being able to really see what's going on, that the website view is possibly a little bit easier to understand than the many spreadsheets of data which I also produce. So in June of this year, we published the 2021 results on the local authority consumption account website. And if you're interested, it is live now, so you can look at it on localfootprint.uk. I was tempted to do a live walk through the website, but chickened out at the last minute. So I'm just going to show you some screenshots of what the website looks like and talk you through how you could start to explore your own data. So next slide, please. The first choice you get to make when you want to view your data is whether you'd like to look at a single year and explore how it is broken down by the different consumption categories, or if you'd like to see a time series to see how your data has changed since 2001. If you could just click to get my next arrow. The next thing to do is to select what area of the country you'd like to look at. So it's all sort of nested UK geographies. So you can look at the UK and expand that to get down to the regions and local authorities that sit within that region. Click, please. You can explore different categories. So you can look at high-level categories such as food, but expand that also down to look at the differences between spend on meat and spend on vegetables, for example. Next, click. And then you can look at a particular year of interest. So at the moment, I've got it set on 2021. And then finally, click. You can choose whether to look at the results on a per person basis or a total for the whole area. Next slide, please. So I've just pulled up some random local authorities and London Council's areas, so you can start to see this picture. You can see we've got the UK, London, Kensington and Chelsea, Hackney in England, and you've got that data broken down by broad categories here. So that's an example of the snapshot view. Next slide, please. And then you can also track the data over time. And here, it's a really good example of what I was talking about in terms of the rebound from private transport. And you can see that London did not rebound as much as we see in Scotland and in the UK. Next slide, please. So the website is now live on localfootprint.uk. If you want to start to explore your data, compare it with everywhere else. And there is an option there to also download and copy any particular views that you'd like to look at. I think that's all from me. I've got one final slide saying thank you. I hope you enjoy looking at these results.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. That was a really good kind of run through, both to see the new tool in action, or not quite in action, but screenshots of it. So I'm sure lots of people will be following that link and looking and digging out their borough data, and just also some sense of, what are the trends that we're seeing, what happened after COVID. There'll be lots of people thinking about, why and what does that mean, and why always the borough comparison, what are those useful comparisons, where are some of the actions, where's some of that scope for action across London, what are the things that we need to tackle together, and what does it indicate? So we've got, we're going to have this next little conversation, then we'll come back to any questions in the chat. Stephen, I can see that you've put one in there as well, and you might want to answer it directly in the chat, or we might come to it in a little bit of the Q&A. Any other kind of questions, please do note them down there. But let's go to our panel. who come from our sponsoring organisations. We've got some questions that I'm going to ask them to help us think a little bit about what does this data mean, how do we use it, who can use it, and how, and what's its significance. So I'll introduce our panel. First of all, we've got Kate Hand, who's Head of Climate at London Councils. We've also got Jamila Bailey, just to see on my screen, yeah, from the GLA, and we've got Pauline Mativier from Re London as well. So welcome to you all. Kate, can I start with you with a couple of questions, really? The first one being is, why is it that consumption-based emissions is, why do you think boroughs might find that a useful way to think about emissions alongside perhaps territorial emissions, which they're a bit more kind of often, lots of us are set up to report on. What does thinking about consumption-based emissions add, and what some of the work and opportunities you see for boroughs to directly take action on reducing those emissions?
Yeah. Thank you, Hannah, and lovely to be here, and just really, really pleased that we're launching the third year of the data, working with our partners. It's really an exciting thing to be able to do. So I think that the data has huge value for emissions. So being able to look, as Anne has described, at that kind of bigger picture, that bigger horizon for really the breadth of our emissions is really important to boroughs, because they have targets for their council, they have many of them targets for their borough, and obviously they are leaders in their community, so they are thinking about how are our residents, what do lifestyles really look like in our borough, how can we help to articulate that to our residents, our businesses, our politicians. So it's bringing into view that kind of wider picture of kind of lifestyles and choices for all of us who live in London, and what that means. One of the boroughs put it in some feedback. They said it's our wider environmental impact. How do we understand that? So I think the data helps us to make that, and because we have the data at borough level, of course, we've seen that the chart of all the borough data is somewhat similar, you might argue. But actually for boroughs, being able to say this is what it looks like for Harrow or Brent or KNC makes it more relevant and more meaningful, both for kind of residents when they're sort of saying, well, what about the place that I live in? What about my choices? But also for politicians when we're trying to say, this is actually what kind of climate commitment means. This is what emissions look like in your broader kind of portfolio. I think that's really helpful. And also having kind of categories that are quite simple and understandable. It's food, it's housing, it's transport. We know what these things are. So understanding, therefore, what you can do about it is somewhat easier. And in sort of very practical terms, some of the things that boroughs do about it. So they use this data to communicate and to say, this is what it looks like in Newham, where I live. This is what the data looks like for what residents in our place and businesses in our place are doing it for residents, for businesses, for politicians. So we know that they're doing that, both for the residents and within the council. So trying to get a whole council approach to actually thinking it's not just your colleagues over in the climate team, it's actually everyone in the council has a role to play. And in terms of some of the kind of specific things they're doing, I mean, just to pick one, because we know that housing and transport are really big areas. But I think from territorial emissions, we know that. But some of the wider kind of supply chain stuff around food, for example, which many of our partners are doing a lot of work on, I think actually that brings into scope things like food waste services. So that's something a number of boroughs have provided, more are providing now. And there's lots of reasons for that, but there's a big climate reason for that as well. So boroughs are giving advice to their residents and saying, this is how you can reduce food waste. And actually that has quite a big climate impact as well. It's that 10% of kind of all emissions. And they're also promoting services like, apps like Too Good To Go and Olio, which help residents to buy cheaper food that would otherwise be wasted. And the last thing is just to say that there are multiple, these aren't just for climate reasons. A lot of boroughs are thinking about this in a cost of living context and saying, actually, we know things are really difficult still for Londoners, but here's a thing you can do that's good for your wallet and good for the climate. And people want to help the climate, but they have other pressures. And this is a really good way that boroughs can help them to do that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kate. Let me turn to Jamila now to talk a little bit about the GLA's take on this. Obviously, GLA has this, look across at London, a big focus on thinking about, people, about London as a whole, looking at different, patterns and communities. And I wondered, Jamila, if you could say a little bit about, you know, when you looked at this report and you looked at the technical report and you heard from Anne's presentation, what kind of questions it raised for you, or what sort of trends and patterns really sparked your interest, thinking about Londoners' behaviour and what's going on. And obviously this is one, you know, often with this sorts of data, it raises as many questions. It really does kind of force you to think, like, why is that? You know, why are we seeing that pattern? What does it mean? What's really happening? And I wonder if there's any different areas where you have really thought about, you know, where you might want to dive in further and look at further sort of research and insight on this.
Hello everyone. Yeah, and thank you for having me talk here. So yeah, I think it's kind of like important to kind of recognise, as you say, like the mayor's kind of context and kind of interest in this data. Obviously, the mayor has like really clear about wanting to shift London to being zero waste and also tackle the climate crisis. And there's a really big task that we've got to do, and neither kind of easy. We know that they kind of require action across multiple levels. And then we also know like that Londoners do care about the climate and want to see action, and kind of whether that's by governments or through the choices that they make and back to products that they use and they buy. So I think whilst we've kind of in the GLA been working alongside Re-London to undertake quite a lot of actions around different policy areas, you know, we know that we need to do more to kind of make sure those are really mainstreamed into our wider policies, and just kind of understanding where our emissions are coming from and this data, and understanding what different trends are that are impacting those, are really important of us thinking about how we can build that and shape that into our future policies, especially kind of demonstrating what is possible and taking direction, and making sure where we're directing our action to where we can make have the most impact. I really think kind of the data and looking at what's in this report kind of and the consumption-based emissions is a really important part of that whole kind of picture of what we use to make decisions. And it's really good to have really good evidence on that, and kind of both the trends and also what might be driving them. And I think that's really important for us to look at from kind of London level. In terms of kind of things that we might then use that for, I think we think about what the mayor or the actions that the mayor can take or the GLA group can take, and where we can lead by example, whether or not that's kind of looking at the kind of things that we procure and how we can reduce the emissions associated with those, and also supporting the different sectors that are kind of highlighted to take action to reduce emissions as well. So yeah, just really pleased that we are kind of able to work with Re-London and London councils and university leads on this project and publish this report today. I think in terms of kind of coming back to your question, I think, you know, we know that London is really unique, and I think it's really interesting to see how the kind of policies and like different infrastructure that we have in London and how that drives different trends in our emissions, and kind of gives us ideas about where we might be able to build on that or where we might want to take specifically more action. I think it's also quite interesting to see where it's not necessarily decisions that are taken by Londoners that are driving those changes. There's other things that are much that are driving some of those emissions changes as well, not just in London but elsewhere, but also kind of really reiterates that it's not also just about the decisions of what people are doing, but also how do we work with supply chains and different sectors to take action on that. So yeah, and I think the other things around kind of London, I think it's really important that we're shown to be acting as a leader in this area. As Kate said, like we're one of the few areas that publish this data, and we really want to be transparent about that alongside our data on the greenhouse gas inventory, and working alongside other cities and demonstrating what can be done. So I think that's really important. I think in terms of like looking at the data specifically from the GLA perspective, obviously we have a strategic London-based kind of approach. So it's interesting seeing those trends for London as a whole, but also for the boroughs at individual level, and seeing where there is a differences and trying to understand what's driving those different changes between the individual boroughs, because obviously that's areas where we know that you're able to maybe take action. Yeah, I think I'll stop it there.
Thanks, Jamila. Yeah, I have a specific question about why food might have become more carbon intensive, and is it just down to the carbon intensity of the grid and food? Anyway, there's lots of things that you can get into, but I think your point around suddenly we can look at the regional comparison and you can think about what's different about London and what's valuable, things like our transport system, but you can also start to ask some questions about, housing, for example, and why that might be such a big part of our equation. Let me hand over now to Pauline from London. And we've talked a little bit about sort of Londoners and communities. We've talked a bit about boroughs. Another really important audience for this is to think about businesses that we'll all kind of work with in our local places. But clearly, there's some significant things to think about when we're thinking about London's businesses and our supply chains and how we work with them. Can you just tell us a little bit about thinking about how businesses, why presenting this sort of data and sort of stories we're seeing might be relevant for businesses and what they might take from this, or how we might think about how we work with our businesses to engage them in some of this insight.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hannah. So yeah, for those who don't know London, we are like a partnership of the London boroughs and the Mayor of London. As our mission as an organization is to make London a low carbon and circular economy. So basically, this is really at the heart of what we do, is about tackling consumption-based emission, and especially those emissions that comes from all the resource, the goods that we import in. And as you say, Hannah, it's obviously about kind of ways of living and kind of consumption choices. But if residents don't have the access to like more sustainable way to consume, to access repair services, to access second-hand shops, to access kind of renting stuff instead of buying new, they're not going to be able to make those choices. So this is why, at London, we work very closely with the boroughs, the GLA, to engage those kind of wider kind of business communities, and make the link between the businesses and the local communities. And so having this data, I guess, is really important for us for like at two levels. The first one, as the other, is like to understand strategically where are the big areas of emissions. And I guess one of the takeaway that I'm taking from Anne's presentation is that it's great. We've seen kind of tremendous kind of decrease of consumption emission overall, but I guess some categories have decreased more than others. We've seen like tremendous improvement in the transport system, but probably slightly less in those areas where where emissions come from kind of embodied, like imported kind of goods and resources into our like the London system. And so, targeting areas such as food, constructions, and kind of materials that our buildings are made of, and all the kind of consumer goods is really important. And kind of linking back to your question, Hannah, this is really helpful in kind of engaging and talking to those businesses. I'm gonna give you, I guess, like just a couple of examples. For example, we're doing like a great work right now with the London Borough of Southwark in a program called High Street Beyond Waste. So it's about engaging and supporting regular kind of high street businesses, like small grocery shops, cafes, like small retailers, but changing the way they provide those services to residents. So developing, I don't know, reusable packaging system, tackling food waste within their own operation, or developing kind of rental instead of selling new items. And having that kind of data really backs up the story for us. And so, really important that we engage with the boroughs to really access those local communities. And I'm very pleased, just to make like a segue to the next session, that we are working with some of the climate programs, the Unveiling program and the low carbon development program, to kind of really activate that with boroughs on a day-to-day basis. And so really looking forward to hearing what they're gonna say about that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Pauline, and thank you for that helpful segue into the next section. So we've had a good look at the picture and the data and what it's saying for London. We started to get into a bit of a conversation about how do we use it. There's a good conversation in the chat, which is some questions about the data, but also what questions does it ask, and we might come to that in the discussion as well. But now in this next part, what we really want to take a look at is what work is going on to tackle consumption-based emissions. A lot of this comes from the Pan-London Council's climate programme, where we work with lead boroughs across London to really look at how do we take action as a collective on some of the really big challenges that we have. And we're going to ask some of those people who are leading that work to come and talk about that here, to give you some practical examples and things that you might want to kind of pick up, get involved with, talk with back at base, and see if that's something that might help you to tackle some of the patterns and trends that we're seeing. So first of all, I think I am handing over to Matthew Adams, who is our lead on One World Living and comes from Harrow. Matthew.
Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, nice to see everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about the One World Living programme. If Ravina could just move on the next slide. For those of you who don't know about this, this is a programme that focuses on materials. So transport, retrofit, etc., or other programmes. This is really about 4 key materials: food, textiles, electricals and plastics, and how we can sort of really try and reduce emissions across the metropolis from those particular material types. I'd say it's very much a team effort, just so it's not Harrow's coordinating, but we work very, very closely with Pauline and her colleagues in Re-London, the GLA. We have a number of boroughs who lead the theme working groups on those 4 particular themes as well. So, you know, it's a really nice programme. We've got a lot of people involved and a lot of goodwill there to make a difference. There's 3 themes we're trying to sort of three sort of outputs we're trying to achieve for boroughs. The first one is around how to engage with our communities. So an example of that would be, for example, the Eat Like a Londoner campaign, which I'll talk about in a moment, which is a food campaign. A lot of this work is around changing behaviours, and we want to sort of help boroughs to engage with their residents in a meaningful way. The second sort of limb of it really is around data and policy. So the consumption-based emissions you just heard about are a key part of that, a really good, robust data set for everybody. But Re-London and the programme have also worked to look at particular material themes as well. There's been what they call material flow analysis, a carbon footprints basically done for London of the food and the textiles themes so far, and there's 2 more in the pipeline for electricals and for packaging as well, which is obviously a big part of plastic packaging, picking up on our theme there. And this data is really good because it sort of helps direct action into the right places, and I'll give you an example of that in a moment. And the third theme is really how do we become better as organisations, as councils, in reducing our own emissions, walking the talk. And one of the key things we can all do there is to work on our procurement. So in West London, for example, we've done a local authority low carbon procurement policy toolkit and charter for our suppliers, which a number of boroughs have adopted. It's available as well for other boroughs. If you're interested in that, contact me, and we're also going to hopefully promote that more through the London Responsible Procurement Network, which is a pan-London procurement group. Next slide, please, Ravina. So I'm going to talk about 3 projects. The first one was Eat Like a Londoner campaign, which ran all of last year. As we've heard, food is a massive part of London's consumption footprint, and the data that came out of the material flow analysis I mentioned really emphasised this. There's nearly 1 billion tonnes of food waste produced by households across London. It's a phenomenal amount, and an amazing and sort of eye-wateringly high 60% of that is edible. So you can immediately see if we can work on food waste, we can make a big difference to emissions. And the other limb of that is around diet choice. So only around 5% of food by volume is actually meat, but that accounts for over 1/4 of the emissions. And conversely, 1/4 of the food volume is fruit and veg, but that's only 4% of emissions. So again, you can easily see that sort of inverse relationship between meat and also dairy and vegetable diets. So the 2 key themes really were reducing food waste and sustainable diets, linked very closely to the benefits around health and cost of living, as was mentioned earlier. So it ran all of last year, a good result on reach. There was over 60 million places it appeared, 80,000 people on the website, and over 2.2 million views of the YouTube videos. The website is available. You can see the link there. Just Google Eat Like a Londoner and it will remain available. And we're currently working with Re-London to plan the second phase of the campaign, which will go live later this year for those boroughs that are involved, and the majority of those 27 boroughs are still involved in the programme. So hopefully that sort of gives you a feel for some of the resources that are already out there and some of the work that's been done. Next slide, please. So just very quickly, because I'm conscious of time, we're also working on a Pan-London Textiles Action Plan. This comes out of the London's Food Fashion Footprint Report, which again, you can Google and gives you sort of good data around textiles in London. The key takeaways really are that we buy a lot of clothes and get rid of a lot of clothes on average as residents across London, and trying to sort of reduce that churn by making things better, using them for as long as possible, and then recycling and reusing as much as possible at the end are the three key areas that we're developing for the action plan. Had a number of workshops already. Thank you for those of you who have already participated, and working with London, Ellen MacArthur and GLA. There is a final workshop on the 12th September, which I think the link to that will be posted in the chat if you'd like to join us for that. And we'll be launching that Textiles Action Plan a little bit later this year. So after focusing on food for year one, the next focus for the coming year is really going to be a big focus on textiles. Next slide, please. And the last thing I wanted to mention is quite an interesting little project. This is hot off the press. We've only just got to this stage where we've got some images now. One of the hard things is sort of seeing how does this all fit together? How do all these material themes and all these initiatives that we hear about around the circular economy fit together to make a sustainable neighbourhood? So we're just nearing the end of an initial project to produce an online tool for all of you and for residents, if you'd like to share it with them. Be available on London Council's website to help sort of envisage what a sustainable neighbourhood looks like. What sort of things could happen in your place, in your local borough, that could make a difference on these 4 themes and other aspects of the circular economy. So if you just scroll on to the next slide, please. So the way that the tool will work is you'll be able to navigate a virtual neighbourhood. Maybe if you scroll on one more slide, Ravina, that'll give you people a better idea. A virtual neighbourhood, which isn't a real place, but could be a real place. But importantly, we have around 20 case studies that are taken from across London, that they're all live case studies really happening in London right here, right now, making a difference in each of those material themes. So they include, for example, the United Repair Centre in Haringey, which is a commercial operation which repairs clothes. It's in partnership with Patagonia, the outdoor centre. They include things like food redistribution and cooking skills classes that are run by London Community Kitchen in Harrow, but they also operate across other boroughs as well. So what we're hoping to do through this is to give you the tools to be able to see, well, these things are happening in London. They've got real benefits, give you the links to those so that if there are things that you think could happen in your borough as well, there's an opportunity to scale existing successful models. And if you just scroll on one final slide, Ravina, there'll be a little bit of information on the site about each of the 4 themes, what that means in practice, what the data is, and then one more slide, Ravina, and then there will be a case studies that are available, which I mentioned. If we've got one more click to get on to the next one. I don't know whether the last slide's available, but if we can't, oh, there we go. So this is an example, for example, of the Library of Things, which is a project that's available in a number of boroughs at the moment, and it gives you some data about the project, what its benefits are in carbon terms, but also in social value and other benefits, and also who you can contact to learn more and hopefully roll that out in your own area. So I hope that'll be a really useful tool. We're going to go live with that, we hope, at the end of the summer period, and we'll launch it formally in Circular Economy Week, which, for those of you who haven't got it in your diary, is the first week of October. And we're also going to be doing a series of site visits for some of these case studies over the autumn and spring period next year, which we'll announce at Circular Economy Week. So plenty of opportunities for you to get involved. And that's it. Thanks, Hannah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Matthew. That's a great kind of overview of some of the projects that are going on and some things ahead that boroughs can both benefit from, and some things where there's still a chance to get involved. The more we get involved and the more you kind of bring your experience and view and the needs of your communities to it, the more chance there is that that this will really make a difference and help you in your work. So moving from one world living, we are now going to have a bit of a focus thinking about low carbon development. So really thinking about how does circularity apply to our thinking about the built environment and the new development we're seeing coming forward in London. I think about infrastructure and buildings and so on. And I'm really pleased to be joined by Hebrina Nikolova, who is from the Borough of Westminster, but is part of one of the core teams who has been developing the low carbon toolkit, which she's going to talk about.
Thank you,
Hebrina,
Hannah. Yeah, no, just really fantastic presentations. I have a lot of questions. Yeah, so my name is Hebrina Nikolova. I'm one of the principal sustainability officers in Westminster within the town planning department. And the low carbon development toolkit is yet another theme in the London Council's climate program, where boroughs from across London came together, another team effort to find and also fund and lead on different areas of climate change, and also just generally collaborate on achieving the shared goal of net zero. And this theme does focus on this basically securing low carbon buildings and infrastructure via the borough planning. So a lot of the things that I'm talking are within the planning stage. There's a lot of complexity that happens afterwards, but we're talking about sharing that vision to be net zero by 2030, which is also ahead of the government. And it is co-led by Hackney Hargay, but the developing low carbon development working group actually consists of many different boroughs, different officers ranging from planning to sustainability, energy, climate change, and we are all committed to maximizing the opportunities to deliver low carbon buildings across London, but also radically reduce emissions, both embodied and operational. Next slide, please. So the planning framework of London around climate change is very complicated, and it changes substantially and continues to change because of building regulations, because of the new London plan, and also because of the industry, because it's quite fast paced and there are a lot of technological advances. The low carbon development toolkit was first launched in November last year, but also has been continuously developed since. And therefore, we do believe that it reflects the highest sustainability aspirations. As I said, it was developed by specialists. This is policymakers, development managers, sustainability officers, and it's a shared learning and knowledge from across many London local authorities. Different items within the toolkits are useful for different users, and most importantly, by sharing information, it encourages consistency across London, and potentially in the future we might see this leveling up in consumption, hopefully reducing significantly and equally across London through policy, through better decision making, and through just a common ambition. Next slide, please. So the toolkit is split into several sections. I probably won't have time to go into each section, but I'll give a bit more of an insight. Some documents provide help to officers dealing with referable applications or major applications, such as the circular economy and the whole life carbon checklist. Others are kind of more borough-specific, best practice in setting up sustainability conditions or Section 103 wording or other just general KPIs. And there are also documents which aim to improve in-house knowledge and such as suggesting training and resources. Next slide, please. So the next slide is an example document. It's a policy compliance checklist for major applications and referable schemes here in Westminster, which is based on the GLA circular economy guidance. Therefore, we do believe that it can be applicable for all other boroughs dealing with referable schemes. It aims to ensure that circular economy approach to the site is maximized and policy recommendations are followed because we find that planning, that circular economy statements vary in size, in quality, even format. So the checklist aims to assist both planners and the applicants by providing questions that their statement must answer. Next slide, please. In the case of non-referable schemes, so on small schemes where there are no specific policy requirements in relationship to circular economy or even whole life carbon, we've produced a simple checklist, and we've integrated this within our validation requirements to show planners, the applicants' sustainability aspirations. So we are trying to help planners make a balanced planning judgment, taking into account embodied carbon emissions, even if the applicant does not take them into account to begin with. Next slide, please. It's a very kind of complicated graph, and I do not expect anyone to read it from the screen, but as mentioned, the field of sustainability is rapidly changing, and even the whole methodology of how we calculate embodied carbon emissions is changing. We have now a new methodology. It's from the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. It's RICS version 2. And it looks like this, and this is just a caption of the many kind of spreadsheets that RICS is recommending for applicants to fill in, which means that there is more and more information and more complexity that is being added to both the planning, the planners, the planning system, but also to the industry and also to policymakers. So while emerging technology and technological solutions are being developed, the checklists that we have presented are probably still the simplest way of understanding applicants and their sustainability intentions. Next slide, please. For further questions, please do get in touch. We are continuing to develop the toolkit. We'll be adding more information. We'd like you to also distribute this amongst your network to give us feedback on how easy it is to understand, to use, and so on. Look at it yourself. And also, if you'd like to just join the working group, please feel free to contact Ashwin or Alice. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Havrina. I think it really just shows that, as you say, you know, that this is hard work. It's a really fast-moving field. How do we support each other to you know, to move with that, to learn and to develop the tools once, and then allow a whole number of boroughs. And I was very pleased that the toolkit won an award at the recent Planning 2024 awards as a really significant intervention on climate in planning. So it is now the award-winning toolkit, which we are delighted with. We've got one more presentation, which we're going to hear in just a second, but just a reminder, please do use the Q&A function. We've got some time for questions and answers afterwards. If there's a particular panelist or contributor who you'd like to ping a question, please do mention them, and I'll pick them up after this next presentation, and we can have some discussion on that. So all questions welcome. So last but not least, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Agathe, who is going to talk to us about low carbon transport. Agathe.
Thank you. So I'm here to talk about low carbon transport, which is led by Kingston and City of Westminster. And I'm really pleased that transport's already been mentioned a few times in this webinar. And I think we can really see how transport can drastically impact a region's overall emissions. And it just shows the importance of pressing ahead with making transport cleaner and greener, because if you don't do that, then you can get quite a significant rebound post-pandemic, and just your emissions will increase as a region. So we're all about thinking about how London can buck that trend and go a bit faster on reducing transport emissions. But we also recognise that improving transport is a really important part of providing a just transition. And we've seen that transport emissions are quite uneven across boroughs. So we also are thinking through this program about how can we improve people's lives through transports by providing a healthier environment and greater accessibility across the city through transport. We also have a added complexity on transport. But boroughs still have really important levers at their disposal. So we're focusing on those levers that boroughs have on low carbon transport. So next slide, please. So these are the levers that we're focusing on through our work streams. And they are the ones that boroughs can really make a significant difference on. To just pick on a few, on active travel, boroughs manage 95% of the roads in London. So it's clear that we have a big role to play in making it easier for people to walk and to cycle. And that's a key part of reducing emissions. Parking and curbside is one that we're really interested in working on with boroughs so that they can use parking curbside a bit more strategically to address some of the big issues like climate change. And then freight is really a significant source of emissions for a lot of boroughs, where private transport is a bit less significant. Freight takes up a really large share of overall emissions. So we're really interested in how to work on cleaner freight. And then EVs and electrification is really critical to decarbonisation and reducing emissions. So we're running a programme to increase public electric vehicle charge points across London. Next slide, please. So what can boroughs do? This is just an example of our work on parking and curbside. So we're looking to provide a package of support to boroughs to help them think about parking and curbside a bit more strategically when it comes to climate change. So we've got a three-pronged approach. The first one is a really practical toolkit around how can you develop strategic aims for your curbside? How can you repurpose curbside space to more sustainable uses? How do you even develop a curbside strategy? And then the second bit of work that we want to do is around, okay, what is the impact of the various parking and curbside policies on carbon emissions? So I can make these changes, but we don't really have a lot of information currently on what impact it's going to have on emissions. So we're aiming to answer that question. And quite importantly, how can parking curbside measures contribute to the borough's overall net zero strategy? We've heard about the importance of that in some of the earlier presentations as well. And then finally, we want to support boroughs to develop business cases for changes to parking and curbside and build out the evidence base around the financial impacts and some of the commercial opportunities that there are with making changes to parking and curbside. So that's just an example of what we are doing with boroughs. So please do get involved if that is of interest. Next slide, please. So please do get in touch if you'd like to be involved in any of those work streams, and we'd be really pleased to work with you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Agathe, and to all our speakers for giving a really good overview. And I would also make a plea, which is you can see from a lot of our work, it is about highlighting and capturing great work that boroughs are doing, and then enabling and providing support to help other places in London to replicate that work. So if you have some really great projects going on around local initiatives on circular economy that we could highlight and capture and incorporate in our visualization tool that Matthew talked about, we would really love to hear from you. If you've been thinking about curbside, are really interested in thinking about that from a climate perspective, starting to work on that, or have got some learnings or thinking about capturing emissions, again, that would be fantastic. And also very much in the planning space as well, if you've got work going on to really think about different tools and approaches to really increase and strengthen policy and practice on circularity and drive down emissions through kind of planning teams, either the tools and policies they're using or the kind of skills and development that we can equip planning teams with, then we would love to hear from you and see if we could share that across London. So the question answers are open. We have had some good responses already with some of our panelists feeding back on specific questions, but let me start perhaps with a question that has been raised, and I think maybe Matthew, this might be one for you, but you can say no if you don't think so. So there's a question that has been raised, recognizing that thinking about consumption-based emissions, definitely in councils, I think procurement and policy, it can be really valuable. But there are a number of other things that councils think about when they think about perhaps sustainable procurement. So I think Simon, who the question comes from, also thinks about labour standards and so on. What are some of the opportunities for boroughs are never thinking about a single issue when they're thinking about procurement? What are some of the opportunities to incorporate this and integrate it, I guess, into council's procurement policy?
Yeah, well, thank you. I can comment, I suppose, on how we did it on the West London procurement policy. So most boroughs already have a social value policy. So this was very much the gap that we were trying to fill, was that people weren't testing on carbon. So the focus of that policy at the moment is very much on reducing emissions from the supply chain. Obviously, there's lots of co-benefits that can arise from that. But we haven't explicitly the questions and there's basically a whole load of draft questions that people can use on their procurements are focused on encouraging the circular economy and reducing emissions. The broader thing around sort of equality, etc., isn't a focus of that toolkit at the moment, but to a certain degree we've picked up by social value. So this was the start. We wanted to do something to get it moving, and that, I think, the other co-benefits that could flow out of all of this work, encouraging the local economy, for example, that's often a much lower carbon solution than procuring from big multinationals. They're all things that can be built on as we develop that work. So it's a good question, but the focus was on the carbon as part of stage one.
Brilliant, thank you.
Can I just add up quickly on that? I think the co-benefits are really important when it comes to procuring in a more circular way. So Matthew mentioned the local economies, and it's all about kind of getting local jobs to kind of recirculate materials and making best use of our material locally instead of importing from kind of big nationals. There is also some health benefit when you think about food and kind of sustainable food, and there is some kind of communities benefits as well. So yeah, that's quite an important area. Even if it's not explicit, it will have those co-benefits anyway. And we've been working with some boroughs and with some of the SMEs we support to kind of acknowledge and measure those kind of co-benefits.
Brilliant, thank you. I have another question, Rabina, where you mentioned in your presentation that things are moving very fast, and planning is having a really big moment generally at the moment. It's a lot of the discussion, and we're seeing quite a lot of policy change feed through from the last few years. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on where the low carbon development toolkit might go next. It's been presented very much as a starting point. It's a live toolkit. We'll build on that. Where you think some of the opportunities for that might be, or what kind of needs it might fill.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Because even the question earlier on the chat, how about retrofitting buildings, retrofitting historic buildings, and the toolkit has a lot more to offer, and also the more data we get just from how the built environment is performing, how procurement is performing, the more we can recommend, as well as just reflect on best practice. At the moment, we are just gathering what is out there and what is what are the kind of the biggest initiatives in-house that we might have. But hopefully in the future we'll have a lot more understanding of what the bigger picture is, and we can collectively just come up with guidance of where we want to be and how to be net zero collectively. Things like circular economy, emissions are across the border. So if we do not collaborate as boroughs, especially around construction, for example, and Westminster, which is very tight on, let's say, things like space, then we won't be able to achieve those things. So we might need to start with just reflecting what we're doing, and then learn on that and create an ecosystem. So hopefully the toolkit is, it could next could be just a digital platform where you can all find this. So it would be fantastic if we just get more and more data, more information, and everyone gets involved.
Yeah, for sure. I think we hear quite a lot that heritage buildings, conservation areas, and so on is something that a lot of boroughs are really thinking about at the moment, particularly when we're thinking about heat pumps or insulation or solar PV opportunities. So I think there's definitely scope and appetite for us to start to develop the toolkit to help people with some of that. And if I could just go to you and see if there's any last questions, but one that I just wanted to pick up a little bit more. There was a really interesting question in the chat which asked about what kind of impacts we might think about from Brexit. We might not quite have the data on that, but I guess, we are not, we are an island, but, clearly, particularly London, we are really reliant on goods and services coming in from outside the UK. And also, obviously we export as well on that front. And then how does some of the data that we capture, kind of how might those sort of trade relationships and flows maybe affect the data? As Jamila pointed out, there's lots that we don't influence, but it's really helpful to understand also what we don't necessarily influence, so that we can help people to kind of navigate that.
Sure. So yeah, when you're taking a consumption-based approach, you're obviously including emissions embodied in imports, and that's throughout the entire supply chain, which can be quite complicated. And I think I've only got off the top of my head from a UK perspective, but it's around half of the emissions associated with UK consumption are embodied in imports. And if you start to look at the carbon intensities associated with different parts of the world, we do see that emissions intensities from European countries are lower on average than other parts of the world. So Brexit could be a concern if it does significantly change our trade relationships. Having said that, I've looked closely at the changing pattern of where we're importing goods from, and as yet there's not a significant move away from Europe being one of our major trade areas. We do only have that data up until 2021 at this point, but I think because supply chains are so complicated, often you'll find that even if a good is badged as being from I don't know, the US, there'll still be Europe in part of its supply chain. So the global trade networks are very, very complicated, and we're not going to see a shift completely away from Europe, because it's still so integral to the way goods and services are produced. But it is a concern, and I think it is something we should be keeping an eye on as the sort of changing trade patterns become evident.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think one last question in the chat, and this one, Agat, for you, which might be around, tell us a bit about, do we have an answer, or are we doing some work to understand the emissions benefits of parking removals or reducing our parking space?
Yeah, I've seen the question in the chat, and I think the honest answer is we don't really have an authoritative source on that, on whether removing one, parking space is what that does to emissions. But that's what we're trying to find out through our work. So we will hopefully collate some of the information that's already out there and look at it, look at the London context to try and answer that question and build the evidence base around different parking and curbside measures. And I think as part of that, we want to look at removing car parking space, but also some of the different things that you can do around parking, for example, exempting EVs from parking charges, etc., that sort of thing. So it's quite a complicated landscape, and there's not something that is for the London context, but that's a gap that we're looking to fill.
And if you would like to get involved in that, please do get in touch with AGAT. And we're also keen to understand how boroughs might use that data to drive change in strategy or decisions in their parking policy. So making sure that's something that really bolsters the kind of evidence base that you're building to underpin that. Brilliant. I'm going to draw this afternoon's session to a close. Thank you so much, everyone who's joined us, who's taken part in the discussions as well. Particular thank you to our panel for giving their time, and to Anne for bringing the work together again, and helping us to really understand what it means for us in London. It's been a really great partnership, one that we hope we will continue. Finally, just thank you very much to my colleagues, to Ravina and Catherine, who have supported this event. We will be sharing the outputs of it. There are lots of links in the chat, but we'll make sure those are available after the session. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a really great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. Thanks a lot.